my name is Kristen, and today we're going to be talking about self-harm misconceptions. A lot of people come to my channel through my self-harm videos. I get a lot of comments about the misconceptions of self-harm. People are telling me to make a self-harm misconceptions video, so today I'm going to deliver and tell you a lot of misconceptions. And I just want to get straight on into this video because there's so many misconceptions about self-harm and I want to clarify them. So if you enjoy that topic, please stay tuned. Today, unlike Kristen, we are drinking peppermint tea because peppermint tea is what you need when you talk about mental health. Misconception number one is that self-harm is just cutting. Now, I just made a video on this about the different forms of self-harm, and no, cutting is not the only way to self-harm. It's the most popular form that's known to the general public, and that's why this is a big misconception, because when you think of self-harm, you usually think of cutting, but that's not the case. Self-harm can be burning, scratching, pulling of hair, hitting yourself. Anything that is deliberately hurting yourself is self-harm. So it's a big misconception that self-harm is just cutting. There are many forms of self-harm, and if you want to know more information, click this video right here. Pretty educational, go watch it. Misconception number two, self-harmers only cut their wrists. Now, we just said that self-harm is not just cutting, but in this misconception, let's just talk about cutting in general. There's a big misconception that cutters only cut their wrists. This is probably because on social media, movies, TV shows, that's generally the way they show it. And yes, people who cut their wrists. But a majority of people who self-harm don't want it to be that visible, so they cut in places where people normally wouldn't see. Their stomachs, their shoulders, their chests, their upper thighs, their feet, places that you wouldn't necessarily see. They try to hide it. So it's a big misconception that self-harm is only on the wrists, and if we actually believe that, then we're not looking in other places where self-harm could be. Misconception number three is that only females self-harm, and I've heard this a lot, and I'm not sure why. Yes, a majority of self-harmers are females, but I found research that said 30 to 40% of self-harmers are male. Any gender can self-harm, anyone can self-harm, and to think that females are the only sufferers of self-harm is, I think, silly. So the next misconception is only teenagers self-harm. And yes, the majority of self-harmers are teenagers, but people of all ages participate in self-injury. Any age can self-harm, to small children to the elderly. Anyone can self-harm, and it's not just teenagers. The next misconception I felt is really interesting, and I did believe this when I was a teenager, but I want to debunk this myth. So the next misconception is only emos or goth self-harm. Now I want you guys to take a look at these two pictures. This one and this one. Which one of these gentlemen do you think self-harms? You shouldn't judge a book by its cover. You can't look at someone and know what they're going through. You can't look at someone and know they're self-harming unless it's visible. In high school, the groups are everything, and some high schoolers don't want to come out as a self-harmer or talk about it or tell anyone because they don't want to be labeled as emo or goth, all of those really negative stereotypes. There's nothing wrong with these labels. It's just attaching self-harm to these labels. When I was actually looking up pictures of what an emo boy looks like, because I wanted to use that picture, there was self-harm all over Google. You know when you type in anything on Google and it says things that are related? The first thing that was related as emo is cutters. Get your shit together, Google, because that's a total misconception, and I don't want to see gory self-harm pictures all over Google. The next misconception is that self-harm is just a phase that only affects young people and that they'll eventually grow out of. No, like I said, self-harm is very common with young people, but people of all ages can self-harm. And to call this a phase, a normal teenage phase, is so silly. Because self-harm is not a phase. Like, whenever someone says that self-harm is a phase, I have this vision in my head of a mom and a dad talking about their daughter, little Susie over here. The dad goes, little Susie's really into boys, probably just a phase. Little Susie's really into wearing dark clothes, probably just a phase. Oh, there's little Susie over there crying and cutting her wrist. Just a phase, she'll grow out of it. I think that's ridiculous and stupid. If you think that self-harm is a phase, it's not. It's a problem that so many teenagers are struggling with. And if you tell that teenager that what they're going through, what they're feeling on the inside is just a phase, you are doing them an injustice, because self-harm is not just a phase. When someone is self-harming, they don't know how else to cope with the emotions inside. So they cut, they burn, they they beat themselves, they hurt themselves, because it releases endorphins and makes them feel better. And they feel like they've found a cure for their emotions, but in reality, they really need help because they're in a lot of emotional distress. So help these people. Don't belittle them. Don't tell them it's just a phase. Reach out and give them the help they need. The next misconception is very, very common. People think that self-harm is a suicide attempt or a failed suicide attempt. No, there is a complete difference between a suicide attempt and self-harm. When someone self-harms, they are not meaning to commit suicide. Majority of the time, don't want to kill themselves. They want to release the emotions that they are feeling, because when you cut, it releases endorphins in the brain, and that's kind of why we get addicted. We're addicted to that release of feeling, make ourselves feel better temporarily. Suicide is wanting to kill yourself. Yes, some people will use self-harm as a suicide attempt, but the majority of the time, it's just for this release. Sometimes there are mistakes that these people who are self-harming aren't safe about it, or they get too emotional and too caught up in the moment and things happen, and it could lead to them getting very, very hurt. But a majority of the time, it's just for people to get that release, and that's completely different than wanting to kill themselves. The intent is different. And the next misconception is that self-harm is attention seeking. I have a whole video on this topic if you are curious about my thoughts about self-harm for attention. Some people self-harm for attention. People started saying that those people aren't real self-harmers, and I think that's absolutely ridiculous. It makes these people who self-harm for attention feel worse about themselves. If you're self-harming for attention, you still need help, because you are deliberately hurting your body. You're deliberately hurting yourself to get attention. So yes, self-harm is for attention. Sometimes it is, and sometimes it isn't. But there's no levels of self-harm. It's just, if a person self-harms, they need help. And to put down people who self-harm for attention, because it's so stupid. Another misconception is people self-harm because they like it. If they didn't like it, they wouldn't do it. This one's stupid too. I don't know anyone who enjoys hurting themselves. I don't know anyone who says, yay, self-harm. I'm gonna go do that right now. It's my favorite pastime. Self-harm is not a fun pastime. If you are self-harming, you have serious emotional pain. Self-harm is used as a coping mechanism, and while it may provide temporary relief, it's not always enjoyable for the person. This next misconception kind of goes along with the misconception that self-harmers only cut on the wrists. It is, if someone self-harms, it should be noticeable. While people do it for attention and show off their scars and take pictures of everything on the internet, the majority of people want to hide their self-harm, and they go to great lengths to do that. With long sleeves, with jeans, with bracelets, with gloves, long shirts, with a lot of things. People go to great lengths and have so much anxiety over hiding. So no, it's not always noticeable. The next misconception is, if someone is self-harming, they can stop when they want to. And no, they can't, because self-harm is an addiction. There have been studies that have shown that when people self-harm, they release endorphins in the brain. When someone self-harms, they're in this complete emotional distress, and they don't know what to do. They find that if you cut yourself, if you bang your head or pull your hair, there's a release of that emotional pain, and so it provides temporary relief for these people, and people start getting addicted to that, and it's a very, very hard addiction to stop. I wish I can tell you the magic word to make someone stop, but it's a process which involves support, which involves treatment, which involves maybe medication. It involves so many things. So no, we can't just stop. I actually heard this one a few years ago, and it's that people who self-harm don't feel the pain. They feel pain differently than what normal people would feel pain. I actually believed that before I started self-harming when I was very, very young, that people who do self-harm, they have something different with their brains, that they don't feel pain the way you and I do. There's been no psychological evidence that that is true. There has been no scientific evidence that that is true. There is no evidence at all that that is true. You are hurting your body, and when you hurt your body, it hurts. And I've never met anyone who was a self-harmer that didn't feel pain. And the last misconception, and I think one of the most important ones, is there's nothing I can do to help a self-harmer. And this is so false, because there are so many things that we can do to help people who are self-harming. One of the most important things that I recommend is listening. Be a good listener. Let them vent to you. Let them talk it out. Do not judge them, because they might say some things that you probably might not understand, but they need support right now. They need your support right now. So be there, listen to them, support them through their treatment, and and support them to go seek treatment, because a lot of self-harmers don't believe that recovery is possible. If you know someone right now who is self-harming and you're watching this video to help them, please tell your friend, your family member that recovery is possible and they can go into treatment, they can go into therapy, work out their problems, work out their issues, get the coping skills they need, and have a better life. And trust me, recovery is possible and you can do it. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you guys would like to stalk me on my social media, my links are over there. If this is your first time on my channel, hi, my name is Kristen and I am a mental health YouTuber, which means that my channel is dedicated to recovery, to mental health awareness, to mental health support and advice. If that sounds interesting to you, then please subscribe above. Join the mental health community, because we are a very supportive community, a very honest community, and a very passionate community about spreading awareness and helping others. So come and join our family today, and I'll see you guys next time with another mental health video. Bye guys.